The moment Celia Kendrick stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Fork, New Mexico, in the spring of 1874, she knew two things with absolute certainty. The man leaning against the hitching post with his hat tilted low over his eyes was the most infuriating, breathtaking creature she had ever laid eyes on, and the letter she clutched in her gloved hand was going to change everything about the life she thought she had planned. Dusty Fork was a town that looked as though the desert had tried to swallow it whole and simply given up midway through. The main street was a wide ribbon of red dirt flanked by wooden storefronts, their painted signs bleached pale by relentless sun. A blacksmith's hammer rang out somewhere down the block. A dog lay across the steps of the general store, unbothered by anything. The air smelled of horses and dry sage, and something faintly sweet that Celia couldn't quite place, like honey that had been left too long in the heat. She had come from St. Louis, answering an advertisement placed in the Missouri Courier by a man named Gerald Hargrove, a cattle rancher in the New Mexico Territory, who needed a schoolteacher for the small community schoolhouse he had funded single-handedly. The advertisement had described Dusty Fork as a growing and spirited town full of opportunity, which Celia suspected was a generous characterization of whatever this place actually was. Still, she had accepted the position with a sense of quiet desperation she had never admitted to anyone. Her father had died that past winter, leaving behind debts she could not pay and a boarding house she could not keep. She had sold everything she owned except 3 dresses, a trunk of books, and her mother's silver hairbrush. She had boarded the stagecoach with $23 and a heart that felt like an empty room with all the furniture moved out. She was 24 years old, and she had decided that whatever Dusty Fork was, it was at least something new. The man against the hitching post straightened as the other passengers dispersed, and she realized with a small jolt of irritation that he was looking at her. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women traveling alone, that particular brand of calculating appraisal that made her want to step backward. He was looking at her with something closer to curiosity, his head tilting the slightest degree as though she were a problem he was quietly trying to solve. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from genuine work rather than deliberate effort, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else. His face was weathered in the way that outdoor men's faces became weathered in their late 20s, all clean angles and sun-darkened skin, and he had dark eyes that, even from 12 feet away, seemed to hold a quality of steadiness that was different from the blankness of indifference. He wore a plain brown duster, worn at the cuffs, and the boots of a working cowboy, scuffed and honest. His dark hair curled slightly at the collar where it had grown a little too long. He pushed off the hitching post and crossed toward her, and she lifted her chin instinctively. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the way a man's voice sounds when he has spent considerable time in places where the silence is large and speaking is something you do thoughtfully. "I am," she said. "Celia Kendrick. And you are Clark Blackwell." He lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "I work for Mr. Hargrove. He sent me to collect you and your things from the stage." She looked at the wagon he gestured toward, a plain buckboard with 2 bay horses, the bed empty and waiting for her trunk. She looked back at him. "Mr. Hargrove didn't come himself." Clark's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something moved behind his eyes and then was gone. "Mr. Hargrove had some business at the ranch come up last minute. He apologizes for the inconvenience." There was something careful about the way he said it, and Celia filed that away without dwelling on it. She handed him the claim ticket for her trunk without further comment, and Clark Blackwell took it and walked to the rear of the stagecoach with the unhurried economy of movement that she would come to recognize as simply the way he did everything. The Hargrove Ranch sat 6 miles north of Dusty Fork, a sprawling operation of several hundred acres that ran cattle across the red and gold grasslands that rolled toward the Sangre de Cristo foothills. The ranch house itself was large by territory standards, 2 stories of timber and adobe with a wide covered porch, and the bunkhouse and stable sat off to the right at a respectful distance. The schoolhouse, Celia discovered, was in town, not on the ranch, which meant she would be boarding at the home of a widow named Mrs. Beale, who lived above her seamstress shop on the main street of Dusty Fork. Clark drove the buckboard in near silence for most of those 6 miles, which might have been uncomfortable except that the landscape was so extraordinary that Celia found herself leaning forward on the wagon bench, watching the way the late afternoon light turned the mesas the color of garnets, and the way the shadows of clouds moved across the open grassland like living things. She had grown up in St. Louis, a city of brick and river noise and the smell of coal smoke, and this openness was unlike anything she had ever seen. It felt enormous in a way that was almost frightening and almost exhilarating in equal measure. "You'll get used to the size of it," Clark said quietly, and she realized he had noticed her wide-eyed watching without her knowing. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "Most people from the East look like they're afraid the sky is going to fall on them the first time they see this country." There was no mockery in his voice, just observation. "Is that how you looked when you first arrived?" she asked, and then immediately wondered if it was too personal a question for a 15-minute acquaintance. But Clark simply said, "I grew up here, in the territory, never really knew anything different." She wanted to ask more. She didn't, because Gerald Hargrove's ranch came into view then, and the focus of the conversation shifted to practicalities. Hargrove himself appeared on the porch as the wagon rolled up, and Celia's first impression of the man was that he was someone who had learned to perform warmth without quite feeling it. He was perhaps 50, heavy through the middle, with a silver mustache and the well-dressed confidence of a man who believed that money was the same thing as authority. He welcomed her with practiced enthusiasm, showed her the comfortable guest room she would use for her first nights before the arrangements with Mrs. Beale were finalized, and spoke at length over supper about his vision for the schoolhouse and his desire to bring real civilization to Dusty Fork. He said the word civilization frequently, with a kind of reverence, and Celia smiled politely and asked sensible questions, and noticed, in her peripheral vision, that Clark Blackwell sat at the far end of the table with the other hired men and ate quietly and did not offer opinions. It was only later, when she was lying in the 2 soft guest room beds staring at the ceiling and listening to the coyotes call in the distance, that she allowed herself to wonder about Clark Blackwell, about the way he had said Mr. Hargrove had some business come up with that slight careful quality, about the way he had noticed her looking at the landscape, about the steadiness in his dark eyes. She told herself firmly that she was not here to wonder about cowboys. She was here to teach school. The Dusty Fork schoolhouse was a single room with 10 rough-hewn desks, a chalkboard that someone had mounted slightly crooked on the back wall, and windows that faced east, which meant the morning light came flooding in gloriously, and the afternoon light was merciful. On the first morning, 11 children arrived, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Celia stood at the front of the room in her second-best blue dress and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though she were exactly where she was supposed to be. The children were a mixed collection of personalities. There were the Whitmore boys, Tommy and Sam, who needed to be separated within the first hour. There was a quiet girl named Rosa Medina, who could already read better than half the older students, and who did so with a focused intensity that Celia found immediately endearing. There was a boy named Daniel Hargrove, Gerald's son, who had his father's self-assurance but none of his father's coldness, and who raised his hand before asking questions in a way that told Celia someone had taught him manners carefully. She taught them reading and arithmetic, and in the afternoon, she read aloud from a book of stories she had brought from St. Louis. And by the time the day was done, her voice was pleasantly tired, and she was already thinking about what she would do differently tomorrow. Clark Blackwell appeared at the end of that first day. She was locking the schoolhouse door when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the main street, and she looked up to see him on a sorrel gelding, moving at an easy walk. He saw her and pulled up, and for a moment they simply looked at each other with the golden late afternoon light slanting between them. "How was the first day?" he asked. "Good," she said, and meant it. "The children are wonderful. The Whitmore boys nearly gave me a headache before noon, but other than that, genuinely wonderful." Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Tommy or Sam started." "Tommy," she said immediately. "That's always how it goes," he said. "Sam just follows where Tommy leads." He paused. "I'm heading into town to pick up supplies for the ranch. Can I give you a ride back to Mrs. Beale's?" She had been planning to walk as she had walked in that morning because the distance was not great and she had wanted the air. But she looked at him on his horse in the afternoon light and said, "Yes, thank you," without quite deciding to. He swung down from the gelding with an ease that spoke of 1,000 hours in the saddle, tied it to the rail, and walked with her down the street to Mrs. Beale's, leading the horse alongside them. She had expected awkward silence or the strained attempt at conversation that happened when people did not know each other well. Instead, they talked about the children and about the town, and about a particular stretch of the trail out to the ranch, where the wild columbines were just beginning to bloom. And by the time they reached Mrs. Beale's shop, the light had gone orange and the air had cooled, and Celia realized she had been smiling for the last several minutes without noticing. "Thank you," she said at the door, and Clark touched his hat brim and said good night, and she watched him lead the sorrel down the street toward the general store and thought that she was going to have to be very careful. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Celia found unexpectedly comforting. She taught 5 days a week and spent her evenings either planning lessons at the small desk in her room at Mrs. Beale's or reading, and sometimes she sat on the front step after supper with Mrs. Beale, a compact woman of 60 with bright eyes and opinions on everything, and watched the main street of Dusty Fork do its nightly settling toward quiet. On weekends she explored the town and the land around it with the particular curiosity of someone who intends to understand a place rather than simply inhabit it. And Clark Blackwell came to town 2 or 3 times a week on ranch business, and whenever he did, something seemed to arrange itself so that their paths crossed. It was never arranged on either of their parts, as far as she could tell. He would appear at the general store when she was there for Mrs. Beale's thread. He would ride past the schoolhouse in the hour after school let out when she was often still inside, rearranging or preparing, and he would stop and knock on the open door and lean in the frame and ask how the day had gone. She began to look forward to these small intersections with an honesty that she found slightly alarming. She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn about a landscape when you can only see it in sections. He had grown up on a small homestead 2 days' ride north, the son of a rancher who had died when Clark was 16, leaving him to handle the place himself with his younger brother, until it became clear the land couldn't support both of them. The brother had gone to Texas. Clark had found work as a cattle hand and gradually become one of the best working cowboys in the territory, known for his steadiness with difficult animals and his ability to read weather and terrain in a way that seemed almost instinctive. He had worked for Hargrove for 3 years and was the foreman of the ranch's daily operations, which meant the men respected him and Hargrove relied on him, even as the relationship between employer and employee remained one of those careful distances that class and money created in the West just as surely as they created it in the East. He read. That surprised her and pleased her in equal measure. He kept a battered copy of Washington Irving's sketchbook in his saddlebag. She discovered one afternoon when something fell from it onto the schoolhouse floor, and when she raised her eyebrows at it, he looked at her with a directness that was almost challenging and said, "You think working cattle means a man can't read Irving?" "Not at all," she said, and she meant it fully. "I think it means you have excellent taste." And the almost smile became an actual smile for just a moment, briefly and completely, and Celia Kendrick felt her carefully maintained composure take one significant wobble. The trouble started in late May, a little over a month after her arrival, and it began not with anything dramatic but with a letter. She found it slipped under her schoolhouse door on a Thursday morning before the children arrived, written in a hand she didn't recognize. It said simply, "Miss Kendrick, there are things about Gerald Hargrove that you ought to know before you count on his promises. If you want to know them, come to the Copper Creek Trading Post on Saturday at noon and ask for Alma Torres." She stood holding the letter for a long time, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and taught arithmetic and reading and an afternoon story about a sea voyage. And she did not mention it to anyone until Friday afternoon when Clark came to the schoolhouse door. She showed it to him without preamble, watching his face as he read it. His expression went through something complicated that he controlled before it fully arrived, but she saw it anyway, that careful quality again, more pronounced than before. "Do you know who Alma Torres is?" she asked. He looked up from the letter and met her eyes directly. "I do," he said. "Will you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the weight of something behind his stillness, something he was calculating or deciding. Then he said, "Alma Torres is the widow of a man named Felix Torres who used to work for Hargrove. Felix died 18 months ago. Hargrove says it was an accident. Some of the men who were there aren't as sure about that." Celia felt the air change slightly in the schoolhouse. "What kind of accident?" "He fell from a horse in a box canyon on the East Range," Clark said. "Alone. No witnesses. Felix had been pushing back on some of the ways Hargrove was handling the land rights of the smaller ranchers in the valley. Hargrove has been quietly acquiring their land, using terms in the leases that most of them don't fully understand, and Felix knew enough law to start causing problems." He paused. "I don't know what Alma wants to tell you, but I think you should go on Saturday." "Will you come with me?" she asked, and it came out more directly than she had quite intended, not tentative, not asking permission, just asking. He looked at her for a moment with that steadiness. "Yes," he said, "I will." The Copper Creek Trading Post was 15 miles east of Dusty Fork, a long, low building of adobe and timber that sat at the junction of two old trails, and they rode out to it on Saturday morning on horses borrowed from a livery stable, side by side on a trail that wound through the red rock country with the late May sky enormous and blue above them. They talked on the ride in the easy way that had become their habit, but underneath the conversation Celia was aware of a new seriousness between them, as though the letter had moved them from one kind of adjacency into something more purposeful. When Clark pointed out the columbines he had mentioned weeks earlier, a scattered blue and white profusion in the shelter of a rock outcrop, she pulled her horse up without thinking and simply looked at them, and he pulled up beside her. And for a moment they sat there in the warm morning, not saying anything, the horses breathing, the flowers impossibly delicate against all that red stone. "They only last about 3 weeks," he said quietly. "Then I'm glad I got to see them," she said, and she wasn't entirely talking about the flowers, and she suspected he knew it. Alma Torres was a woman of perhaps 40, with dark eyes full of intelligence and grief in proportions that Celia recognized from her own reflection in the months after her father's death. She sat across a rough table from them in the back room of the Trading Post, and spoke in a voice that was steady because steadiness was something she had chosen rather than something that came naturally, and she told them what she knew. Hargrove had been systematically cheating the smaller ranchers and farming families in the valley, using lease agreements that contained provisions most of the signers couldn't read. He had effectively transferred mineral rights and water rights to himself from more than a dozen families who had no idea they had signed those things away. The water rights mattered most, because in high desert country, control of water meant control of everything else. Felix Torres had been helping those families understand what they had signed, and had been writing letters to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. The letters had not arrived, and then Felix had died in that box canyon. Alma had copies of the original lease agreements, which Felix had quietly obtained. She had been afraid to come forward alone. She had heard about the new schoolteacher from St. Louis, a woman with no connection to Hargrove beyond the employment contract, and she had thought that such a woman might be in a position to help in a way that she herself was not. Celia looked at the papers almost set on the table and looked at Clark, and Clark looked back at her with those steady dark eyes, and something in the look between them felt like an agreement that went deeper than words. "I'll write the letters to Santa Fe," Celia said. "I can write them under my own name. I'm an employee, not a dependent. He can't control what letters I send." "He can make things very difficult for you," Alma said quietly. "He is not a man who accepts interference." "Then we'll need to move quickly," Clark said. He looked at Celia again. "This isn't what you came here for." "No," she agreed. "But it's what's here, and it would be wrong to look at it and walk away." The steadiness in his eyes deepened into something warmer, something that made the space between them feel charged and close, even though they were sitting 3 feet apart at a rough wooden table in the back of a trading post with another woman watching. They rode back toward Dusty Fork in the long afternoon light, and the conversation they had on that ride was different from any they had had before, more serious and more personal both at once. Clark told her that he had known something was wrong about how Hargrove operated but had not had the evidence to do anything, and that the knowledge had sat in his chest like a stone for a year. She told him about her father's debts and the boarding house in St. Louis, more than she had told anyone in Dusty Fork, and he listened with the full and genuine attention that some people gave to words on a page, that quality of actually receiving what was being said. "I'm sorry about your father," he said, simply and without the awkward formality that people often wrapped such condolences in. "Thank you," she said, equally simply. "He was a good man who just wasn't careful. I loved him very much." "I understand that," Clark said. "My father was much the same." She looked at him riding beside her in the long light, his profile clean against the sky, and something shifted inside her chest, something that she recognized with a mixture of joy and apprehension as having crossed a line she had not intended to cross. She was in love with Clark Blackwell, or she was becoming so, which at this point amounted to the same thing. She focused on the trail ahead and said nothing about it, and neither did he. But when they reached Dusty Fork and he helped her down from her horse, holding her hand a moment after she was steady on the ground, they both knew something had changed between them, and they let it be known without naming it, because some things say themselves better through silence than through words. Over the following 2 weeks, Celia wrote 4 careful letters. One went to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. One went to the Federal Land Office in Albuquerque. One went to a territorial newspaper in Santa Fe, whose editor she found listed in a directory at the general store. And one, the most carefully written of all, went to a federal land commissioner whose name Alma Torres had provided, a man who had apparently been building a case against land fraud practices in the New Mexico territory for the better part of a year. She wrote them at her small desk late at night, by lamplight, after Mrs. Beale had gone to bed, with Alma's documents copied out in her clear and careful schoolteacher's hand. She included the original lease language, the discrepancies between what had been verbally promised and what was written, and a concise account of Felix Torres' death and its suspicious timing. She was thorough and unemotional in the writing because she knew that emotional writing was easy to dismiss and factual writing was not. Clark knew what she was doing. They did not discuss it in detail because there was no safe place in Dusty Fork to discuss it in detail without risk of being overheard. But he would appear at the schoolhouse in the late afternoons, and she would pass him finished letters folded inside what appeared to be lesson planning documents, and he would get them to the post riders who went out from the trading post, not from Dusty Fork's own post, which Hargrove had a friendlier relationship with. It was during this time that whatever was growing between them began to take a shape that was harder to ignore. One Wednesday afternoon in early June, a thunderstorm came rolling off the mountains with startling speed, the way New Mexico storms did, going from a distant blue-black bruise on the horizon to a full wall of rain and lightning in under an hour. Celia was in the schoolhouse when it arrived, and she was not alarmed by it because it was beautiful, that particular violent beauty of a high desert storm. But she was very aware that she was going to get thoroughly soaked if she tried to walk to Mrs. Beale's. Clark appeared at the schoolhouse door with a slicker over his arm and his own already on, water streaming from the brim of his hat, and he held the slicker out to her without explanation. "I can't take your slicker," she said. "It's an extra from the ranch," he said. "Put it on." She put it on. It was huge on her, reaching her knees, and he looked at her in it with that almost smile and said, "All right, let's go." They ran through the rain together down the main street of Dusty Fork, which was a river of red mud in under 10 minutes, and they were both laughing by the time they reached Mrs. Beale's door, genuinely and helplessly laughing, the way rain makes people laugh when it is dramatic enough and they are together and safe. He held the door open for her, and she ducked inside and turned to look back at him standing in the rain, soaked through, and for a moment they were both suspended in the laughter and the rain and the sight of each other. "Thank you," she said, the laughter still in her voice. "Any time," he said, and his eyes were warm in a way that had nothing to do with the slicker, and then he turned and walked back through the storm toward the hitching rail where his horse stood, and she watched him go with one hand on the doorframe and the understanding in her chest so sharp it was almost painful. She told herself she had to focus on what needed to be done. The letters had been sent. They needed to be patient. She needed to not let her feelings complicate something that mattered to people like Alma Torres and the families who had signed those misleading leases. But the human heart does not easily accept logic as its governing principle. The next Sunday morning, after church, Clark was waiting outside with a suggestion that they ride out to see the canyon country to the east, which she had expressed an interest in weeks ago. He said it with the straightforward simplicity of a man who has decided to stop pretending. He isn't looking for reasons to spend time with a particular person. She accepted with the equal straightforwardness of a woman who has made the same decision. They rode for 3 hours through country that grew more dramatic the further east they went, the land dropping away into canyons that showed their geological history in striped layers of red and gold and white, the light alive on all of it, the air clean and hot and faintly scented with juniper. They ate lunch on a flat rock above one of the smaller canyons, dried beef and cornbread that Clark had brought in his saddlebag, and they talked about everything and nothing, books and the children at school and the territorial politics, and what Clark thought the territory would look like in 10 or 20 years, and what Celia missed about St. Louis, and what she did not miss at all. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked. She looked out at the canyon and the light and the impossible scale of the landscape. "No," she said, and it surprised her as she said it because she realized it was completely true. "I don't. I thought I might, but no." She paused. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not anymore," he said, and the way he said it was almost imperceptibly weighted, as though the word anymore was doing a great deal of work. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were sitting very close together on that flat rock above the canyon, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into sun, and the moment extended itself into something that was not quite speech and not quite silence. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face behind her ear, a gesture so gentle and so careful that she held very still under it the way you hold still when a wild thing comes close enough to touch. "Celia," he said, and just her name, nothing else, and in his voice it sounded like something he had been meaning to say for a long time. "Clark," she said back, and it came out with all the feeling she had been carefully managing for weeks, something warm and open and entirely true. He kissed her then, leaning across that slight distance, and she kissed him back, and the canyon and the red rock country and the enormous blue sky went on being exactly what they were, indifferent to this small human moment that was, to both of them, anything but small. When they pulled back and looked at each other, she was smiling and he was too, fully and without reservation this time, and she thought that his smile was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "I have to tell you something," he said, and his tone shifted just enough that she felt a small current of apprehension move through the warmth. "Then tell me," she said. "When I agreed to go to Copper Creek with you and found out about those letters and everything you were planning," he said, "I went to Hargrove the next day and gave him my resignation. I told him I'd finish out the month so there'd be no trouble with the cattle and he could find someone else for foreman. But I'm done working for him at the end of June." She stared at him. "You gave up your position because of what we found out." "I gave up my position because I couldn't keep working for a man I knew was cheating people," he said simply, "and because I didn't think I could help you do what needs to be done while I was answerable to him." The care in that, the quiet and principled weight of it, landed in her chest with an impact that she felt for several seconds. "What will you do?" she asked. "I have some money saved," he said. "There's a piece of land about 8 miles north of town that's been for sale since the family that homesteaded it went back east last year. Good water on it, good grass." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a while." She looked at him looking at her and she understood without him spelling it out what it was he was thinking about. He was not making a declaration. He was not asking a question. He was simply being honest about the shape of his thinking, and she found that honesty more moving than any dramatic speech would have been. "It sounds like good land," she said. "It is," he said, and that was all for now. Gerald Hargrove found out about the letters on the 15th of June. She was teaching a morning arithmetic lesson when the sound of horses in the street drew the children's attention to the windows, and she looked out to see Hargrove's carriage pulled up in front of the schoolhouse. She told the children to work on their sums and opened the door herself. Hargrove was standing on the step. His performed warmth was gone. He had the look of a man who had decided that politeness was no longer a useful tool. "Inside," he said. She stepped back into the doorway, not quite letting him in. "I have students," she said. "Then this will be brief." His voice was flat and controlled. "I know what you've been sending to Santa Fe, Miss Kendrick, and to Albuquerque, and wherever else you've been sending your letters. I want you to understand that your employment here is contingent on my goodwill, and that goodwill is, at this moment, very much in question." Celia looked at him steadily, her heart hammering in a way she did not allow to reach her face or her voice. "My employment contract," she said, "was with the town board of Dusty Fork, not with you personally, Mr. Hargrove. I believe you funded the schoolhouse, which I appreciate, but the contract itself is with the board." "The board does what I tell them," he said. "Then I suppose we'll find out," she said. She held his gaze without blinking. "Was there anything else?" He looked at her for a long moment, reassessing something. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know this territory and you don't know what it costs to cross the wrong people in it." "I know what it costs to look away from injustice," she said just as quietly. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his carriage. She watched him go, her hands clasped in front of her so that no one would see them trembling slightly, and then she turned back to her students and said, "Very well, who can tell me what 6 times 8 is?" in a voice that she was proud of. Rosa Medina raised her hand. 48, Miss Kendrick." "Exactly right, Rosa," Celia said. "Exactly right." She told Clark what had happened that evening, sitting on the steps of Mrs. Beale's shop in the cooling air, with the last of the daylight going pink above the mesa to the west. He listened with his usual full attention, his forearms resting on his knees, his hat in his hands. "He's frightened," Clark said. "That means the letters are having an effect." "He said he'd have me removed from the schoolhouse," she said. "The town board includes Doc Whitmore and Ezra Calloway and 3 other men. Whitmore and Calloway signed those leases. When they find out what those leases actually say, they're not going to be cooperative with Hargrove." He paused. "Have you got any response from Santa Fe yet?" "Nothing yet," she said, "but it's only been 3 weeks." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I'm worried about you being here alone, Mrs. Beale is elderly and the shop is right on the main street." He looked at her directly. "Hargrove won't do anything dramatic. He's too smart for that, but he has men who could be encouraged to make things uncomfortable. I'm not going to leave, she said. I'm not suggesting you leave, he said, and there was something almost fierce in the steadiness of his voice. I'm suggesting that someone should be nearby who can be useful if things get difficult. I moved out of the Hargrove bunkhouse yesterday. I'm boarding at the hotel on the south end of town. She looked at him. You're staying in town on my account. I'm staying in town on my own account, he said, and the look he gave her was direct and unambiguous and warm. Because I have a stake in how this goes. The land situation matters to this community, and the woman who decided to do something about it matters to me. Both things are true. She looked down at her hands in her lap and then back up at him, and she said, quietly and without drama, I care about you too, Clark. I want you to know that clearly. He was still for a moment, and then he said, I know, and the simplicity of it, the certainty without arrogance, told her that he had known, and that it matched something he was carrying in his own chest. They sat together on Mrs. Beale's steps until the stars came out, which in New Mexico in June came out in such numbers and such clarity that sitting under them felt like a minor religious experience. And they talked and sometimes were quiet in the comfortable way of people who are at ease with each other's silence, and neither of them made any grand declarations because none were needed. The understanding between them was as clear and as certain as the night sky, and that was enough. The response from Santa Fe came in the last week of June, and it came not as a letter but as 2 federal land agents who arrived on the Tuesday morning stage and went immediately to the office of the Dusty Fork sheriff, a capable man named Samuel Ord, who Celia had come to trust, and who, it turned out, had quietly harbored his own suspicions about Hargrove for several years. She found out about the agents through Clark, who had seen their arrival from the hotel window and recognized the federal insignia on their saddlebags. They met that evening at the Copper Creek trading post with Alma Torres, who had kept her nerve through all of this with a quiet courage that made Celia deeply respectful of her, and the agents, whose names were Harris and Beaumont, listened to everything and reviewed Alma's documents and asked careful questions for 2 hours. The investigation, Harris explained, had been building for over a year. Celia's letters and Alma's documents had provided the specific evidence that allowed them to act. The Territorial Land Commissioner in Albuquerque had already issued a summons for Hargrove's appearance before a federal land court in Santa Fe. The process would take time, months likely, perhaps longer, but it was initiated and formal and legal, and it would not be stopped. Alma Torres' hands were folded on the table, and she was crying quietly, without sound, the kind of crying that happens when a long-held tension finally releases. Celia reached across the table and put her hand over Alma's, and Alma turned her palm up and held on. Clark, beside Celia, said nothing, but she felt his hand move briefly to rest at her back, a quiet and certain presence. Gerald Hargrove left Dusty Fork 3 days later. He did not leave dramatically. He simply had the ranch's foreman position posted at the sheriff's office one morning, and departed in his private carriage that afternoon with 2 of his trusted men and a number of luggage trunks, presumably for Santa Fe to meet with lawyers before the federal proceedings could catch up with him. The ranch itself remained, still operating, with a skeleton crew and no clear leadership, because Clark's formal employment had ended on the 30th, and the new position had not yet been filled. The town of Dusty Fork, which had lived under Hargrove's particular brand of benevolent authority for years, went through a strange period of adjustment, like a room in which all the furniture has been rearranged, and people kept reaching for chairs that were no longer where they expected them. The town board reconvened without Hargrove's influence for the first time in a decade, and the meetings were longer and louder and considerably more democratic than they had been before. Doc Whitmore and Ezra Calloway and the other families who had signed misleading leases had those documents formally reviewed by a territorial attorney who confirmed what Felix Torres had known. The provisions were manipulated and legally challengeable. The federal process that would restore those rights was slow, as such things always were, but it was happening. It was real. Celia kept teaching. The schoolhouse remained open because the town board voted unanimously to keep it open, and the children were oblivious to most of the adult drama around them, being primarily concerned with their sums and their stories, and who got to ring the bell at the end of the day. Rosa Medina asked, one afternoon while helping Celia clean the chalkboard, whether she was going to stay in Dusty Fork. "I think so," Celia said, and meant it with a wholeness she could feel from her feet to the top of her head. "I think this is home now." Rosa considered this. "My mother says you're brave," she said. "Your mother is very kind," Celia said. "She says brave and kind aren't the same thing," Rosa said with the philosophical certainty of an 11-year-old. "She says you're both." Celia looked at the child and felt something in her chest open like a window. "Tell your mother thank you," she said. It was on the 4th of July, when Dusty Fork had its celebration in the main street with a bonfire and a fiddle player, and a man who did rope tricks that made the children scream with delight, that Clark asked her to walk with him to the edge of town, where the street gave way to the open grassland, and the sky was still lit at the horizon with the last of the evening color. They stood at the place where the town ended and the land began, and the fiddle music drifted back to them, and the stars were beginning to appear overhead. "I put down a deposit on the land north of town," he said. She looked at him. "When?" "Yesterday," he said. He was looking at the horizon, and then he turned to look at her directly with the full and steady regard that she had come to love about him. "I want to build something there, a proper ranch, something that's mine, that's honest and right from the ground up." He paused. "I want you to know that. I want you to know what I'm planning." "I'm glad you told me," she said. "I'd like to tell you more," he said. His voice was quiet, certain, without being presumptuous. "I'd like to spend considerable time telling you things, and hearing things from you. I'd like to spend a great deal of time with you in general, Celia, if you're willing." She smiled. She could feel the warmth of it moving from her chest into her face. "Clark Blackwell," she said, "you have been spending considerable time with me for the past 2 months, and neither of us has had any complaints about it." "That's true," he said. "Then I don't imagine I'd start complaining now," she said. He laughed, genuinely and fully, and it was the best sound she had heard in a long time. Then he was looking at her with that warmth that she had catalogued and treasured from the first time she had seen it, and he took her hand in both of his, carefully, and with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, and he said, "I love you. I want to be clear about that. I've been thinking it for a while, and I wanted to say it clearly." The words landed in her chest with the quiet force of something true. "I love you too," she said. "I've been meaning to say it clearly as well." He kissed her under that enormous star-scattered sky with the fiddle playing in the distance, and the grassland going away in all directions around them, and it felt to Celia like arriving somewhere, like the moment when you have been traveling for a long time and you step down onto new ground and you know, with a certainty that goes all the way through you, that you are home. The summer passed, full and bright. Clark began work on the land north of town, breaking ground for a house with 2 other men he hired from among the displaced workers from Hargrove's ranch crew, men who were good and steady, and simply needed someone to work for who was not crooked. He was out there every day, and sometimes Celia rode out on the weekends and watched the walls of the house go up against the sky, adobe and timber, and a wide front porch that she had not suggested, but that appeared anyway, oriented to face the mesa to the west where the sunsets were best. She asked him about the porch one Saturday afternoon in August. "It seemed right," he said, and the simple certainty of it told her everything she needed to understand about why he had built it facing west. They were officially courting, in the way that the small community of Dusty Fork recognized and respected, which meant he sat with her at church on Sundays and escorted her to the town's social evenings, and stopped by the schoolhouse in the afternoons with the frankness of a man who is making his intentions visible to the community, because his intentions are serious and honest. The town largely approved, or at least those parts of it that were not Hargrove's remaining partisans, and those partisans were fewer every month as the federal proceedings in Santa Fe made news and people's understanding of what had happened shifted. Mrs. Beale approved vigorously and expressed this approval by making Clark an exceptional apple pie that he brought back to report on with great enthusiasm, which delighted Mrs. Beale to the point that she made him another one the following week. Doc Whitmore, on the day that Celia stopped by his office for some headache powder, looked at her over his spectacles and said, "Young woman, Clark Blackwell is the best man in this territory, and if you've got the sense I think you've got, you won't let him go." "That's my intention, Doc," she said. He nodded with satisfaction. "Good," he said. Alma Torres came to Dusty Fork in September to tell them that the federal land court in Santa Fe had issued its preliminary ruling on 3 of the challenged leases, finding in favor of the original landowners and ordering the water rights restored. It was not the complete resolution, which would take another year at least, but it was the beginning of resolution, solid and documented and real. They sat around the table at the Copper Creek Trading Post again, the same place they had first gathered, and Alma told them this news with a face that had a different quality now than it had the first time Celia had seen it. The grief was still there, permanent as a scar, but there was something alongside it now that had not been there before. Something that looked like peace. "Felix would have been very happy today," Alma said. "He would have," Clark said. "He was a good man." Alma looked at Celia. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said. "You were new here. You had no stake in it." "Everyone has a stake in whether things are right or wrong," Celia said. "That doesn't change with geography." Alma reached across and squeezed her hand, and Celia thought of the first time they had done that, when Alma had cried at this same table, and the long months between that moment and this one, and all that had grown in that time. On a clear October morning, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone entirely gold, and the air carrying the first real edge of autumn cold, Clark asked Celia Kendrick to marry him. He did not do it with elaborate ceremony. He did it in the most characteristic way possible. They were walking along the creek that ran through the northern edge of his land, the land that now had a house on it, a real house with glass windows and that west-facing porch, and she was talking about a lesson. She was planning on the geography of the territory when he stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him, and he was looking at her with everything in his face, all the quietness and the warmth and the steadiness and something else, something more unguarded than she had ever seen in him, something that was very close to the face of a man who is standing at the edge of something important and has decided to step forward. He took both her hands in his. "Celia," he said, "I have spent the last 6 months being very certain about one thing above all others, and that thing is that I want to spend my life with you. I want to build this ranch with you. I want to sit on that porch with you in the evenings and watch the sunsets and talk and be quiet and watch the years go by with you beside me. I love you. I want to marry you if you'll have me." She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had driven a stagecoach passenger to a ranch and tucked her hair out of her face in a canyon, and given her his spare slicker in a rainstorm and left honest work for honest principles and built her a porch without being asked, and she said, "Yes, Clark Blackwell, I will absolutely have you." He pulled her toward him and held her there with his arms around her, and she could feel his laugh, a deep quiet sound, and she laughed too, and the gold leaves drifted down from the cottonwoods around them, and the creek made its steady noise beside them, and none of it could possibly have been more perfect. They were married on the 28th of November, 1874, in the small Dusty Fork church, which was decorated with dried wild grasses and the last of the autumn flowers that Mrs. Beale had somehow located and arranged with the intensity of a woman with a mission. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Ames, a wiry man of 70 who had been marrying and burying the people of Dusty Fork for 20 years, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be doing the first rather than the second. Celia wore her best dress, a deep green wool that she had purchased at Mrs. Beale's seamstress shop, and that Mrs. Beale had altered without being asked, adding a collar of fine lace that had been in a box in the back room for years waiting, Mrs. Beale said, for the right dress. Clark stood at the front of the church in a new dark coat and clean boots, and looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that made everyone in the church smile. That particular look that a man produces when he sees the person he loves walking toward him, and the sight of it overrides everything else, every composure and reserve, and the whole feeling of his heart becomes briefly visible on his face. Alma Torres was there, sitting in the second row with her daughter. Rosa Medina was there with her mother. Doc Whitmore was there, and Ezra Calloway, and the Whitmore boys, who managed to behave for the entire ceremony, which Doc Whitmore later called miraculous. Sheriff Samuel Ord was there, and the two men who had helped Clark build the house, and a dozen other people of Dusty Fork who had become, over these months, something that felt genuinely like community. The vows were said in the old simple way, the way that meant what it said without embellishment, and when Reverend Ames pronounced them married, Clark took her face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness that was also completely unguarded and completely real, and the church applauded, and Mrs. Beale produced a handkerchief from somewhere and was not embarrassed about it. The celebration afterward, at the town hall, which had been cleared of its usual furniture and set with borrowed tables and enough food to suggest that every woman in Dusty Fork had been cooking for 3 days, had a quality of genuine joy that Celia recognized as something earned rather than simply assumed. These people had been through a difficult year with the Hargrove situation, and the resolution of it, still ongoing but clearly turning toward justice, had released something in the community, some held tension. The celebration of her and Clark's marriage happened inside that released joy and was colored by it. The fiddle player from the 4th of July was back. Clark danced with her, turning out to be a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said that he had not always lived on cattle ranches, and that there had been a time in his early 20s when he had spent a winter in Taos where dancing was considered as essential as eating. She laughed and he spun her again, and the room went around them in a blur of lamplight and faces and music. They danced together for a long time, and when they were not dancing they were side by side at the table or standing in conversation with the guests, and every time she looked at him she felt the same thing, warm and certain and new, the feeling of a life rearranging itself into the shape it was supposed to have. They rode home to the ranch under the winter stars, the horses blowing plumes of breath in the cold air, and she leaned against his shoulder on the wagon bench and looked up at the stars and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Dusty Fork 8 months ago with $23 and a trunk full of books and a heart that felt empty. She thought about the distance between that woman and this one, not geographical distance, but the kind of distance that is measured in what you have come through and who you have found and what you have decided to be. The ranch house was warm when they arrived, because Clark had banked the fire carefully before leaving, and the west-facing porch showed the dark silhouette of the mesa against the stars, and the night was very quiet except for the horses and the wind moving through the grass. She stood on the porch for a moment before going inside, looking at all of it. Clark stood beside her. "Welcome home," he said. "Welcome home," she agreed, and meant it with her whole self. The winter of 1874 into 1875 settled over the New Mexico territory with a cold that was serious but not brutal, the kind of cold that required respect and preparation, but rewarded both with a beauty that took the breath, clear skies and frost-white grass and sunsets that blazed orange and violet over the mesas. Celia continued to teach at the Dusty Fork schoolhouse through the winter, bundled in the heavy cloak Clark had insisted on buying her in November, making the ride into town on the days when the weather allowed, and sometimes staying at Mrs. Beale's during storms that made the roads impassable. She loved her work with a depth that only grew as she came to know the children better. Rosa Medina was reading works of literature by December, which Celia encouraged by lending her books from her own small library. The Whitmore boys, once separated into different rows and given different responsibilities that played to their individual strengths, turned out to be capable and even enthusiastic students. Daniel Hargrove, Gerald's son, had remained in Dusty Fork with his mother, who had always been independent of her husband's dealings, and he was one of Celia's steadiest students, a quiet boy with a good heart who Celia thought would grow into a good man. The ranch found its footing that winter as well. Clark had the land, the house, and 3 good horses, and he put in a water system that winter using the creek that ran through the northern edge of the property, a gravity-fed arrangement that an old-timer in town had described to him in detail, and that Clark built with the same methodical care he brought to everything. By February, he had also acquired 12 head of cattle from a rancher 2 counties over who was selling down his herd, and the cattle grazed the winter grass of the ranch's lower pastures and were the beginning of something real. The federal proceedings in Santa Fe continued to move, slowly and officially, through the machinery of territorial law. Clark received a letter in January from federal agent Harris, saying that Hargrove had appeared before the land court with his attorney, and that the proceedings were expected to extend through the spring at minimum, but that the evidence was strong, and the court was not sympathetic to land fraud practices that had been proliferating in the territory. 3 more families received preliminary rulings in their favor on the water rights questions by the end of February. Alma Torres came to Dusty Fork in March with news that the ruling on Felix's case, the question of whether the circumstances of his death warranted further investigation, had been formally referred to the territorial marshal's office. Nothing might come of it. The evidence was old and limited. But it was acknowledged, formally and officially, which was more than it had been when Celia had first sat across that rough table from Alma at the Copper Creek trading post. Alma stayed for 2 days, and on the second evening she came to supper at the ranch, and they ate around the table in the warm kitchen that Celia had made her own over the winter months, and there was something in the evening that felt like a chapter closing gently and with grace, not the end of the story, but the end of a particular urgency that had shaped so many of the months behind them. "What will you do now?" Celia asked Alma, as they sat after supper with tea. "My sister has a small dry goods store in Taos," Alma said. "She has been asking me to come and help her run it. I think I am ready to say yes." She paused. "There is life still to be lived." Felix would say the same thing if he could. Celia reached across and took her hand briefly, as she had twice before, and Alma smiled, with the grief and the peace both there as they always were. Spring came to the territory in the way that spring always came, not gently but suddenly, as if the land had decided to move from one state to another all at once. The grass came up green and vivid after the winter, and the cattle moved to the upper pastures, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their leaves in a rush of pale gold green that was startling after the bare months. The columbines bloomed again in the shelter of the rock outcrops, and Celia rode out to see them specifically, on the same trail where she and Clark had seen them a year before. He rode with her, as he often did on Sunday mornings when the ranch work permitted, and they pulled up at the same spot above the same rock where the flowers grew, and she looked at them and felt the year turn complete in her mind, a full circle from that first spring when she had barely known him to this spring when he was her husband and the ranch was their home and the life around them was built and real and good. "They're better this year," she said. "Good spring for them," he agreed. She looked at him. "Clark," she said, "I think I should tell you something." He looked at her with his full attention. "We're going to have a baby," she said. He was very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that is not emptiness but its opposite, a moment of such complete reception that everything else stops. Then she saw his face change, not all at once but in layers, the steadiness becoming something more open, the warmth becoming something that was too full for a word like warmth, and his eyes were bright in a way she had never quite seen. "Celia," he said, and just her name again, as he had said it in the canyon the year before, but carrying something different now, something vast and tender and entirely new. "Sometime in October, I think," she said. "Mrs. Beale agrees with me, and she's delivered enough babies in this town to have a reasonable opinion." He reached across and took her hand and held it with a gentleness that was the same quality as the way he had first tucked her hair from her face. That care, that attention. And she felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the fullness of it, from the abundance of a life that had seemed, 18 months ago, to have very little left in it. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am so happy," she said. "Are you?" "I don't have words for it," he said, which was the most honest thing he could have said and more than enough. They rode home through the spring morning with the territory going green around them and the sky its irreducible blue overhead, and she thought that if she had been asked, the day she boarded the stagecoach in St. Louis with $23 and a breaking heart, whether she could imagine arriving here at this, she would not have known how to say yes. Not because it was impossible, but because she had not yet learned the language of this kind of happiness, the language of good honest work and real love and land that was your own, and a community that had become your people. She was learning it now. The summer was full and demanding in the way that ranch life demanded, the cattle needing movement, and the water system needing maintenance, and the grass needing monitoring, and the 1,000 other tasks that Clark managed with his particular quality of steady competence. Celia taught through June and arranged for a substitute teacher for the fall months, a young woman who had come west from Kansas with her husband and who had teaching experience and was glad of the work. She spent the summer gardening, which she had never done in St. Louis, and which turned out to be profoundly satisfying, coaxing vegetables from the desert soil with the same patience that Clark brought to everything, and watching them grow with a pleasure that she suspected was partly about more than vegetables. She read widely, from the continuing collection of books she was slowly acquiring through the general store's book ordering service, and through occasional packages from a bookseller in Santa Fe that Doc Whitmore had recommended. She sat on the west-facing porch in the evenings with Clark and watched the sunsets, which were never twice the same and never less than magnificent. She grew rounder through the summer and into the fall with a physical contentment she had not expected, a sense of her body knowing what it was doing even when the discomfort was real, which it was, persistently, and sometimes inconveniently. Clark was attentive without being fussy, solicitous without being smothering, present in all the ways that mattered and sensible enough to leave her to her own competence in the ways that didn't. She loved him for that balance as much as for anything. Doc Whitmore came to the ranch in the 3rd week of October, on a gray morning when the first real cold had arrived, and the sky was the color of pewter. He had his bag, and Mrs. Beale was with him, because Mrs. Beale had made clear that she would be present, and no one had felt the need to disagree with her. Clark was banished to the kitchen, where he stayed with a focused stillness that was its own form of anxiety, and Celia could hear him moving around out there occasionally, which was oddly comforting. It was a long day, but at 4 in the afternoon, as the pewter sky was going dark, their son arrived in the world. He was healthy and insistent about announcing himself, which Doc Whitmore said was an excellent sign, and he had dark hair and the kind of face that new babies have, all furious opinion and absolute newness. Clark was allowed into the room, and Celia watched his face when he first saw the child, the same layers moving through it as when she had told him about the pregnancy, but deeper and more complete. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful gentleness of someone who has never done this before and is fully aware of the weight of what he is holding. And he looked down at the small face and then up at Celia and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "He looks like he has opinions." He announced himself rather forcefully, Celia agreed, resting against the pillows with the deep tiredness of labor and the deep satisfaction underneath it. "Good," Clark said. "A man should know his own mind." He paused. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names. They had not settled on one. "James," she said, "for my father." Clark looked at her. "James Blackwell," he said, trying the sound of it. "James Felix Blackwell," she said, "if you agree." The second name had not been part of any conversation, but it arrived in the moment as something obvious and right, and she saw Clark understand it. The inclusion of Felix Torr's name in the name of their son, this small act of memory and acknowledgement. "I agree," he said, without hesitation. "James Felix Blackwell." The baby in his arms blinked at the lamplight with the ancient and furious concentration of the newborn, entirely unconcerned with the significance of names. "Welcome, James," Clark said to him, quietly and with complete conviction. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was the first winter with a baby in the ranch house, and it was exactly as exhausting and exactly as astonishing as everyone who had done it before had suggested it would be. James Felix Blackwell was a determined child from the beginning, with a clear preference for his own schedule over anyone else's, and an enthusiasm for examining the world that manifested, in the early months, primarily as a refusal to sleep when anyone else wished he would. He was also, undeniably, a remarkable person, and Celia understood in a new way, watching him discover his own hands and then his own voice, and then the face of his father who always came when he called, why people spoke about parenthood with that particular quality of overwhelm. Clark was a natural father in the way that people sometimes are, not perfect and not pretending to be, but present and patient and genuinely fascinated by this small human being he had helped to make. He talked to James constantly while doing the ranch work that kept him near the house, narrating in a low voice what he was doing and why, on the theory that children understood more than adults gave them credit for, and that being spoken to honestly was a good beginning for a life. Celia returned to teaching in the spring of 1876, when James was old enough to be left in Mrs. Beale's capable and delighted care for the morning hours. Mrs. Beale had greeted the news of this arrangement as if she had been given a gift, and she proved to be exactly the kind of grandmother that James deserved, firm about schedules and endlessly indulgent about stories. The school had grown. There were 14 children now, because Dusty Fork was growing, slowly and steadily, as the territory developed and the railroad talk that had been background noise for years became more concrete. New families were arriving, and some of the older homesteads that had been abandoned or lost were being reoccupied by people who came with the specific intention of making something permanent in the Red Rock country. The federal proceedings against Hargrove concluded in the spring of 1876 with rulings that returned water and mineral rights to 11 of the 14 families who had signed the problematic leases. The remaining 3 cases were more complicated because of jurisdictional questions, but an attorney working for the territory had taken them on without fee, and the expectation was that they would resolve similarly within the year. Hargrove himself was fined substantially, and his remaining land holdings in the valley were subject to audit. And though he did not go to prison, which Celia found imperfect but accepted as the nature of the legal system, the structure of his control over the valley was permanently dismantled. When she heard the news from Clark, who had received a letter from Agent Harris, she sat for a long time with the letter in her hand, thinking about Alma Torres in Taos, and Felix Torres, who had died in a box canyon, and Rosa Medina, who could already read nearly anything she set her mind to, and the 11 families who had their water rights back, and the future of the valley that would now be shaped by something other than one man's greed. It was not perfect justice, but it was justice, genuine and documented, and it was enough to build on. Clark came and sat beside her, and she handed him the letter, and he read it, and then he folded it carefully and set it on the table. Felix Torres would be satisfied, Clark said. He would, she agreed. They told James about Felix Torres when he was old enough to understand, not because it was a heroic story, but because it was a true one, because it was part of the world he had come into, and the world his parents had helped to shape before he arrived. They told him in the simple language that parents use when telling children true things, and he listened with the focused attention that had been the most characteristic thing about him since the day he was born, taking it in with the seriousness of a child who intends to make something of what he is told. Dusty Fork changed around them through the late 1870s, changed in the way that all towns in the expanding territories changed, growing and complexifying and losing some things and gaining others. The railroad arrived in a town 15 miles to the west in 1878, which meant better access to supplies and a slowly increasing trickle of new settlers that would become, over the next decade, a steady flow. The school grew to 20 students by 1878, and the town board voted to build a second classroom, which Celia designed in consultation with the carpenter, insisting on proper windows and adequate light and enough space for the children to move freely. The ranch grew in step with the territory. Clark was a careful rancher, expanding deliberately rather than ambitiously, adding to the herd only as the land could support it and the water could sustain it. He had the reputation throughout the valley of being a man who ran honest cattle on honest terms, who paid his hands fairly and treated his land with the respect of someone who understood that the land would outlast him and should be left better than he found it. He was known in the way that men like him are known in small communities, not loudly or dramatically, but with that deep and solid recognition that says this is a person you can count on. When other ranchers had trouble with their water systems or their fencing or their cattle and needed an experienced hand, Clark went, because that was what neighbors were for. When Sheriff Ord needed someone steady to help with a difficult situation, Clark went, because that too was what community required. And Celia was known in Dusty Fork, in the way that teachers are known in towns that are young enough to remember what life was without proper schooling, which is to say, with a particular gratitude that bordered on reverence. The children she had taught in those first years were growing up, and when she walked down the main street of Dusty Fork, she heard her name called from half a dozen directions by people of varying ages who had sat at those rough-hewn desks, and the knowledge of that continuity, the way that what she had built was woven into the fabric of what the town was becoming, was a satisfaction that she recognized as the deepest kind. Rosa Medina came back to Dusty Fork in 1879 at the age of 16, with news that she had been accepted to a territorial school in Santa Fe that prepared young women for the teacher's examination, the first young woman from Dusty Fork to do so, and she came to the schoolhouse the morning before she left to tell Celia. Celia looked at this young woman who had been an 11-year-old girl in her first class, cleaning chalk dust from the board and asking whether she was going to stay, and she felt something that went past pride into something more personal. "You did this," Celia told her. "You had the mind and the will, and you did this." "You showed me what it could look like," Rosa said. "Someone who came from somewhere else and decided to make something here. Someone who knew what books were for." Celia embraced her, because there was nothing more adequate to say, and Rosa Medina left for Santa Fe the next morning with her mother's blessing and Celia's best wishes, and a note she had written to the director of the teacher's school describing Rosa's abilities in terms that left no ambiguity about what kind of student they were receiving. The house on the ranch grew as the family did. A second child arrived in the winter of 1880, a daughter they named Margaret Ruth, after Clark's mother, whose middle name was Ruth, and whose steadiness Clark said he had been trying to live up to his whole life. Margaret arrived with a different personality than her brother, quieter and more watchful, with her father's dark eyes, and a quality of observation that suggested she was absorbing everything around her, and would produce her own considered opinion on it in her own good time. James, who was 5 when Margaret arrived, received her with the solemn importance of an older sibling who has been preparing for this responsibility and takes it seriously. He sat beside her crib and talked to her in the same low narrating voice he had absorbed from his father, explaining the world in small, careful sentences, And Celia stood in the doorway watching this, and felt the same quality she had felt on the day she first saw Clark's face when he held James, that overwhelming abundance, that fullness that had no adequate word. Life had not been without its difficulties. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was hard, one of the hardest in the territory's recent memory, with cold that cracked the earth and a late snow that came in March when the calves were young, and needed the kind of watching that meant Clark and his hands were out in weather that was merciless, keeping the animals together and moving and alive. He came in at night with his hands frost-cracked and his face tight with exhaustion, and Celia would have the stove hot and food waiting, and they would sit together at the kitchen table after the children were sleeping, and she would listen to the day, and he would listen to hers, and there was in those evenings, even the difficult ones, a quality of partnership that she valued as much as any other part of their life together. There were also the ongoing questions of what the territory's growth meant for the people who had been in it before the wave of Anglo settlement arrived. Celia was aware, teaching in that schoolhouse, of the complexity of the West, the Apache peoples whose land this had been, the Mexican families like the Medinas who had been in the territory for generations before Americans arrived with their land offices and their homestead laws. She could not resolve these large historical facts from her schoolhouse in Dusty Fork, but she could teach honestly, could include the true history of who had been where and when, could teach Rosa Medina's younger siblings with the same quality of attention she gave to every student regardless of their family name. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was what she could do, and she did it with full commitment. By 1882, Dusty Fork had a proper school building with 2 teachers, a doctor's office, a small hotel that was better than the original, a newspaper that was independent and said what it thought, and a population approaching 300. It was becoming a real town, with all the contradictions and complications that entailed, and Celia had been there for its becoming and felt herself genuinely part of what it was. In the summer of 1882, she and Clark sat on the west-facing porch one evening in late August, as they had done so many hundreds of evenings before, watching the sunset go through its colors over the mesa. James was inside somewhere, reading with the deep-focused intensity of an 8-year-old who has discovered that books are inexhaustible, which had been one of Celia's greatest satisfactions. Margaret sat between her parents on the porch in the rocking chair that Clark had made during the long winter evenings, too small for the chair but entirely disinclined to admit it, watching the sunset with her characteristic quiet attention. "That one," Margaret said finally, pointing at a particular streak of orange above the darkening mesa. "What about it?" Clark asked. "That one is the best color," she said, with the decisive certainty of a 2-year-old who is entirely confident in her aesthetic judgments. "I think you're right," Celia agreed. Clark was smiling at his daughter in the fading light. He looked up and caught Celia's eye across the top of Margaret's head, and the look between them was one of those that carries everything. That says what words could only approximate. All the years and the seasons and the children and the work and the storms and the sunsets, and the simple daily companionship of a life built together out of honest things. She reached across Margaret and took his hand, and he held it, and the sunset continued its transformation above the mesa, orange becoming violet, becoming the first deep blue of evening. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "What?" he asked. "That stagecoach," she said. "That afternoon. You were leaning against the hitching post with your hat tilted over your eyes, and you looked so thoroughly at home in the most enormous landscape I had ever seen." She paused. "I thought you were infuriating." He laughed, low and genuine. "You had your chin up and your back straight, and you looked like you'd come here to do something significant," he said. "I thought the town had no idea what it was in for." "Were you right?" she asked. "Completely," he said, and squeezed her hand. "Mama," Margaret said, with the irreproachable focus of a small child who considers adult conversations to be interruptions in her own personal experience, "Is the sky going to do the purple one tonight?" "Almost certainly," Celia said. And it did, spreading out above the mesa in a wash of violet and deep blue as the last of the light went, as the first stars appeared one by one with the unhurried certainty of things that have always been there and will be there still, and the air cooled around them, and the ranch was quiet in the good way of a place that is working and cared for and alive. They sat together on the porch until the sky was dark and full of stars, and Margaret had fallen asleep in her chair with the complete and boneless trust of a sleeping child, and James came to the door and said good night in the serious way he had about everything, and Clark carried Margaret inside and Celia followed, and the house was warm and lit, and everything in it was true. This was what she had come west for, though she had not known how to imagine it when she had stood on the St. Louis station platform with $23 and a breaking heart. Not this specifically, not the ranch and the children and the man she loved and the town she had helped to shape, but this quality, this realness, this life that was entirely hers, built from honest work and genuine love and the decision, made over and over again in small and large ways, to be present for whatever the territory asked of her. Dusty Fork, New Mexico, 1874. A woman stepping off a stagecoach into the enormous light, and everything that followed. In the years after, when people in Dusty Fork talked about the town's history, they talked about a few particular things. They talked about the land fraud case and the families whose rights had been restored. They talked about the school and what it had become. They talked about Alma Torres, who came back to visit from Taos twice a year and who had become a figure of quiet community legend. They talked about the federal proceedings and what they had changed about the valley. And sometimes, not always but sometimes, they talked about the schoolteacher who had stepped off the stagecoach in the spring of 1874 and the cowboy who had been waiting at the hitching post, and how two people finding each other in a place like Dusty Fork could turn out to be, in its own quiet way, the most important thing that happened. Celia would have disagreed with the characterization, at least the part about importance, because she believed firmly that the children she taught, and the families whose land rights were restored, and the community that had grown from something Hargrove controlled to something the people of the valley owned together, those things were what mattered, and she and Clark were only two of the many people who had contributed to them. But she kept that disagreement mostly to herself, because she also understood what people meant when they said it. They meant that some things begin in a particular moment and grow from it in ways that cannot be anticipated, and that the moment, in retrospect, has a quality of rightness, of necessity. They meant that certain meetings change the shape of everything that follows. She understood that. She had understood it for a very long time. On a September evening in 1883, a full 9 years after she had first arrived in Dusty Fork, she stood on the west-facing porch with Clark and watched the kind of sunset that stopped you in your tracks, the whole sky going from gold to amber to a deep burning red that reflected off the mesa face like a fire. And she thought about all the sunsets they had watched from this porch, all the evenings, all the conversations and the silences. James was 9 now, tall for his age, with his mother's clear eyes and his father's steady way of moving through the world, already showing the shape of the man he would become, someone thoughtful and principled and entirely capable of surprising you with what he was quietly thinking. Margaret was 3, in full possession of her personality, which was considerable, and her opinions about everything, which were freely shared. There would be a third child, Celia knew. She had told Clark that morning, and the scene had been a variation on the one 9 years ago in the canyon with the columbines, the same quality of reception, the same overwhelm of feeling that had no adequate word. The sunset burned itself out slowly, the way the best ones did, reluctant to cede the sky tonight, and Clark put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the cooling air watching the last colors go above the mesa that faced their house. She had come west with nothing but a trunk of books and a determination to make something of what remained. She had made something. Something real and large, and full of people she loved and work she believed in, and a landscape that had become as necessary to her as breathing. The territory was still wild in all the ways that mattered, still demanding and still extraordinary, still capable of taking the breath with its beauty and humbling the ambition with its scale. But it was also home, undeniably and completely, the way a place becomes home when you have put your labor and your love into it, and it has given you back everything you needed to build a life. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Clark pressed a kiss to her hair, easy and certain, the gesture of a man who has been doing this for years and intends to do it for many more, and she smiled and the stars came out above the mesa, and the night settled around them like a blessing, which is what it was.